So
Yep.
first of all, how's it going?
Well, it's going all right. We're knocking on as many doors as we can, having a lot of conversations with people. But it's how people choose to vote on the day. Never take the voters for granted, because ultimately they will decide. It's true in Leeds Central, it's true in the country as a whole.
So some at home might recognise your name from the Benn Act,
Uh-huh.
a big Brexit bill. For
Yes.
those that might not know about it, what does that mean for the Brexit process?
Well, when Boris Johnson became Prime Minister, he said, well, we're leaving on the 31st of October, come what may, do or die. So we either get a deal or we leave with no deal. And there's a group of us backbenchers in Parliament who had and have very different views on how the Brexit story might end, but who were agreed on one thing. We were very strongly opposed to a no-deal Brexit. We came together and put forward legislation which required the Prime Minister, if he hadn't got a deal through Parliament by the 19th of October, so the bill allowed him to try and get one, he had to write a letter to the European Union applying for a further extension.
Here we have the right to vote in this election, but also in the referendum. In your constituency, 45.96% voted leave. As their MP, have you represented them in Parliament?
Well, my constituents, the nation, were split basically down the middle. I mean, Brexit has been a very divisive question. Now, following the referendum result, I voted to trigger the Article 50 process, because if we hadn't done that in Parliament, we would in effect have been saying the referendum result meant nothing. And I felt it was an obligation to do so, even though I was a passionate, and still am, a passionate Remainer. But over the intervening 3 and a bit years, what have we discovered? The referendum posed a very simple binary question, in or out, but it failed to address the consequences of an outvote, namely what kind of future relationship we're going to have with our biggest, nearest and most important trading, political, economic partners. Parliament has been deadlocked, despite people's best endeavours. We've had at least 3 different versions of Brexit. The former Prime Minister's, Theresa May's deal, Boris Johnson's deal, Nigel Farage argues for a no-deal Brexit. So if those who are calling for Brexit can't even agree on what kind of Brexit it is, and Parliament is deadlocked, and we're 3.5 years on, and we now know that it involves difficult choices, I think the sensible and the democratic thing to do is to go back to the people and say, here is what leaving looks like. Is that what you want to proceed with? And if you don't, then here's Remain.
So people who are watching this who still haven't changed their minds, they still think leave is the best option.
Yeah.
They might be worried that your personal opinions of Brexit and the best way to see this out might not align with theirs, and as their representative, you may not follow their wants.
Well, in a binary choice, an elected representative can't follow the wants of the people who voted leave and the people who voted Remain, because it's a binary decision. And in life, in politics, you have to stand up for what you think is right, and then people will hold you to account. I think if I were a leaver, and if I were a leaver who was confident that the British people haven't changed their minds, why would you be worried about a confirmatory referendum? Because presumably you would think the British people would vote again to leave. And I'm absolutely clear on my mind that Brexit will be bad for the economy. And if it's bad for the economy, we have a less strong economy than we would have had. And that is going to affect our ability as a country to address many of the causes of the vote for Brexit, some of which were to do with Europe and some of which are to do with the nature of our society and the way which people have lost out.
So if you expect the Labour to win this election, but not by a majority, would you expect a coalition with a party like the Lib Dems or potentially the SNP?
Look, I think we just have to take it a stage at a time. We're fighting in every seat to win. We'll see what the consequence of that is when the results are declared. But sure, I hope we have a Parliament when the election is over in which there is a majority of MPs who are prepared to vote for a final say referendum. And then the people will decide.
So, say Labour don't win this election.
Yeah.
You've been a vocal critic. You didn't vote for Jeremy Corbyn as leader of the party last time. Would you expect him to stand down?
Look, I'm not going to speculate on the outcome of the election before we know the result. You can ask me that question after the result. I hope we're going to win. It goes back to what I said at the beginning. There's a very fundamental choice on offer this election. I've been in elections where you knock on doors and people say, you're all the same. No one can argue that the parties are all the same in this election, anything but. And given how our society has evolved, and given the problems of left behind communities, people living in poverty, over 1 million people going to a food bank, people being told they're fit for work when they're clearly not fit for work, the short-termism of much of the economic system, either we say, well, that's fine, we just carry on. These are the prices that you have to pay for that. Well, this is not a price that the Labour Party is prepared to pay, and we're offering something different. So right up until the close of polls at 10 o'clock on Thursday night, I should be doing what I've always done, which is campaigning my best to get Labour elected.
Your niece Emily has called out racism a lot online.
Yeah.
She has been incredibly vocal, has caused waves, some would say. She's faced a lot of abuse for it. Do you think enough has been done to stamp out violent rhetoric in politics, especially towards young women?
No. It's one of the most troubling aspects of our political culture and our broader society, the level of abuse. I think social media has kind of magnified this. Some people have gone to prison because of the threats they've made against members of parliament and candidates. I think women in politics get it much worse. No one's ever threatened to rape me, but I'm sorry to say there are people who have threatened to rape MPs of all parties. And now we have the law, and if somebody does something which breaches the law, then due process should follow, because it seems to me that is a way you send a message. We've seen some former MPs say, I'm not standing again because I don't want to put myself and my family through this. We really ought as a society to pause and say, is this what we want? I want people to come and stand for elected office. I want people of all ages to participate in our political process. But if that's what you get for standing up for what you believe in, then there's something very wrong, because I think we will lose people of talent and ability.
I'd like to bring things a bit more local now, focusing
course.
on your constituency. So the area of Holbeck falls under your constituency. Obviously now there's the managed approach with certain businesses. Going forwards, obviously there's been a few complaints from the local community. What would be your stance surrounding the managed approach? Last
Summer, I came to the conclusion that we needed to review the way in which it was working, and I proposed to the council and the police that an independent review should be undertaken, and the council took up that idea. It is now happening, because people have very, very different views. People say, I want it to stop. Those who say, I think on balance this is better than what we had before, and I look forward to seeing the result of that. It's very important that everyone who has a view and experience is able to contribute. The last thing I would say is this. When people have come to me as the MP and said, we just want it to stop, we want you to end, the council and the police, to end the managed approach, my response is to ask this question. Okay, it's a fair point, and I understand why you feel the way you do. But if we announce tonight that the managed approach was being terminated, what do you think would happen tomorrow? And what do you think would happen the day after that? Would the problem go away? I suspect not.
You call it a problem, the managed approach, the police, their precautions in place. Are they there to protect women or just to sanction them, do you think?
Well, now that's a really good question, because one of the arguments in favour of the managed approach is that it has improved the relationship between the sex workers and the police. Now, they are potentially very vulnerable, but if you talk to the organisations that support the sex workers, they will say there has been an improved relationship, and that means improved reporting of men who assault or abuse sex workers, so they can have the criminal law applied to them.
You've voted in the past to support the operations in the Iraq War under Tony Blair and other operations as well, whereas Jeremy Corbyn has been in extremely vocal opposition of such operations. Should there be another vote in the future, would you fall in line under the party leader's stance?
That's an impossible question to answer, because what are you talking about? What's the subject? What are the circumstances? Now, look, in the case of the Iraq War, as I've said many times before, had we known then what we know now, that there were no weapons of mass destruction, then Parliament wouldn't have voted for it. But in respect of the vote in 2015 on Daesh, Daesh were, and still are, a group of genocidal, raping, sex enslaving, decapitating fascists. That's what they are. And the argument I made in that speech when I was Shadow Foreign Secretary was we were already taking them on in Iraq, but we weren't in Syria. A porous border, they were moving back and forth. I don't mean to rehearse the whole argument. But there's no doubt that the support from the air, backing up the Kurdish fighters on the ground and others who were taking on Daesh, in the end resulted in the large area of territory that they controlled, in which they enslaved people, they no longer control it. Now, the ideology has not gone at all, and that is a longer term fight, but I thought it was the right thing to do in those circumstances.
Why should students vote for you in this election?
I've been the local MP for 20 years. I'm here to help people, and I stand by my record and I'm happy to be judged on it, because it comes back to a very fundamental choice about what kind of society we want to live in. And I think in the policies that Labour is putting forward, we would have a different and a fairer and a more just country. And I think that is the choice. We either accept the things we see around us which nobody can justify and say, well, that is the price that has to be paid, which is the Conservative approach, because they've been responsible for large parts of it. Or we can say we can do something different. And when people argue, well, that's all a bit, over the top and extreme and so on and so forth, the level of public expenditure which Labour is arguing for in this campaign would take us back to roughly where France and Germany are, which have centre-right, centrist government. It cannot be right that in the fifth richest country in the world, 1 million plus people, including some of my constituents, are asking a stranger to help feed them. There's something absolutely fundamentally wrong. Communities that have been left behind by economic change, making further and higher education free, abolishing student fees in particular, and lots of other changes.
Can I just ask, on abolishing student fees, would you also get rid, if you had the chance to vote on it, would you get rid of previous student debt?
Well, Jeremy answered this question and said, people argue, Labour's just promising everything to everybody. Well, we're not. And he gave a very honest answer. He said, that is not a commitment that we can give now. We will look at it, but that is not something that is in our manifesto, because, as Nye Bevan famously said, socialism is the language of priorities, and our manifesto sets out what we think are the priorities, because it's about giving people a helping hand to make the most of their potential. That is what this wonderful institution is all about.